Chapter 1, Learning Disabilities and Related Disabilities, Characteristics and Current Directions. What I'm going to be doing for each chapter of the book is I'm going to be taking the slideshow that was prepared by the publisher of your textbook, and I'm going to be elaborating on that slideshow. So you'll have a copy of the slideshow that you can look at your own leisure, but then in addition to that, you'll have the version that has me talking. Some of the chapters are longer than others and may actually require more than one video. Each video will be 15 minutes or less. So here we are for chapter 1. They start with what they call 2 truths and a lie. Here are 3 statements. Learning disabilities is considered a high incidence disability. That's number 1. Number 2, the term cognitive disabilities has replaced the term mental retardation. And number 3, 7% of all students with disabilities are identified under the category of emotional disturbance. Well, it's kind of a trick question. Number 1 we know is true. Learning disabilities is the largest group of all children being served under special ed law. And so almost half of the kids receiving special ed services are under the category of specific learning disabilities. So we know that one's true. Number 2, the term cognitive disabilities has replaced the term mental retardation. Well, something has replaced the term mental retardation, but is it cognitive disabilities? Well, actually, in some sources you'll see it called cognitive disabilities, but the federal law uses the term intellectual disabilities, and so that's number 2 is the one they consider to be a lie. I think that's stretching it a bit. And then number 3, 7% of all students with disabilities are identified under the category of emotional disturbance. That's a larger number than we used to have. The changing scene in special ed. We have a decrease in the number of students with learning disabilities. At one time, they represented about 7% of all children in school, and now it's about half of that. So why? Well, one thing is that state certification and licensure for special ed teachers in a lot of states is now non-categorical. So, for instance, in Mississippi, although the child for state reporting purposes will have an SLD ruling, the teachers are certified in mild disabilities. Well, in some states, even the kids are certified as having mild disabilities, and so you don't have that categorical title anymore. Second thing is response to intervention. As we have worked harder and harder to give support to kids who struggle in school, we find that fewer kids are being identified for special ed services. The number has dropped from about 11% nationally of children being served in special ed to about 7% of children being served in special ed. And then the other thing is that more students receive instruction in inclusive settings. And so because of that, teachers are not as inclined to refer kids for special education because they'll still be in the room anyway. And your book asks, do you think this is good or not? And we'll have a conversation about that. So, related disabilities. We have, and these are considered, the first 3 are considered to be high incidence disabilities: intellectual disabilities, emotional and behavior disorders, and learning disabilities, and then other health impaired, which includes the big growing category of, does anybody know, attention deficit disorder. So, here are the characteristics of all 4 of those groups. They have problems with attention, they have problems with motor abilities, they have problems with psychological processing. So that includes things like memory, that includes things like visual and auditory perception issues. Poor cognitive strategies of learning. They don't really know how to approach learning tasks. We call that metacognition. And then problems with oral language. Also, reading difficulties, writing difficulties, math difficulties, and poor social skills. So then they talk about the intellectual disabilities. Basically, what we're talking about here is the group that used to be called mentally retarded. So we're talking about limitations in cognition, limitations in adaptive behavior. Emotional behavior disorders. These are children who are having trouble learning, but we can't say that it's an IQ problem, it's not a vision problem, it's not a hearing problem, it's not a health problem. They have trouble building interpersonal relations. They have inappropriate types of behavior. They have moods of unhappiness and depression. They have physical symptoms or fears. And you have really two categories, the kids with emotional problems and the kids with behavior problems. In some states, they're going to identify mostly emotionally kids with emotional problems, not many with behavior problems. Mississippi is one of those states. In other states, they will serve both groups of kids. Other disabilities that are related to learning disabilities: autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's, which is the high functioning version of autism. Right now, they're reporting 1 in 50 children with autism, and at a later date, we'll talk about why that might be so. And then the category that this book is mostly concerned about is learning disabilities. And learning disabilities, it's a neurobiological disorder in the basic processes used in understanding spoken or written language. The first time this term was used was in 1963. Before that, they were kind of lumped together with kids with attention deficit disorder and kids with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. So here's the federal definition. The federal definition talks about psychological processing, and by that what we mean is how you perceive the world around you. So we're talking about visual perception, auditory perception, kinesthetic and tactile perception. We're also talking about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic memory. Difficulties in learning that are not primarily due to other causes. The Interagency Committee on Learning Disabilities talks about it being a matter of social skills disorders. Joint Committee on Learning Disabilities talk about it being intrinsic to the individual. The DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for the American Psychological Society, they put it into the categories of reading disorders, written expression disorders, and math disorders. At different ages, LD is going to look different. So with preschool children, it's going to be a matter of fluency, that they're going to be they're going to be talking slower than other kids, using fewer words. Elementary age kids, it's going to show up mostly in reading. Secondary kids, it's going to show up in the metacognitive skills and the social skills. In adults, it's going to show up in just difficulty in organizing, executive function. So all the different definitions talk about neurological factors, that it's tied to neurological or neurochemical problems. All of the definitions talk about it being cognitive processing, how we process information. All the definitions talk about difficulty in academic and learning tasks. And all of the definitions talk about discrepancy between potential for learning and achievement. And all the definitions talk about how you have to rule out other causes. So we have some laws that affect this. You've had Survey of Exceptional Children, or you'll have it, and you'll talk about the laws in detail. I'm not going to do much with the laws in this class. I'm not going to do much with the history of learning disabilities in this class. So what I do want to talk just a little bit about, though, is terminology. In the federal definition, it actually talks about brain injury and minimal brain dysfunction. In the early days, 1940s, the assumption was that children who had what we now call learning disabilities, that what was wrong with them is they had some sort of minimal brain dysfunction that we just didn't have the equipment to detect. And the reason they said that was because children who actually did have brain injuries, where they had some sort of traumatic injury, their behavior and their learning patterns were very much like these children that were having learning problems that didn't have brain injury. Well, later on, when we got more sophisticated brain imaging, we found out that the kids with learning disabilities actually do sometimes have a different brain structure, maybe not damaged, but a different brain structure. Parts of their brains may be larger or smaller. And then also when we do imaging that shows how the brain is actually processing information, we find that there are parts of their processing that don't go smoothly. And we'll go in more detail about all of that later. Okay, some other things is the difference between right brain and left brain. That's been one theory. Cerebral dominance, that some people have one part of the brain that is more dominant than the other. Lateral preference, whether you prefer to use the right side or the left side of your body. They've done post-mortem anatomical studies where they've looked at the brains of people who had learning disabilities. We've done genetic studies, and we've done what are called functional MRIs, where we actually look at the brain as it's doing tasks. So what are we looking at now? What are the things that are part of the field of learning disabilities now? More inclusive placements, making sure that kids are in the general ed classroom all of the day, if at all possible, and taking the same subjects as everyone else, but with support. Response to intervention to keep kids from ending up receiving special education services, and then testing based on standards, and then also looking at the difference between a learning disability and a child who has cultural and linguistic diversity. And so that is chapter 1 in less than 15 minutes. How cool is that?